Greetings and welcome to another episode of Haunted History with Sherri Brake. That's me. In each episode, we'll venture down the not so straight path of the paranormal and dark history, exploring the oddness of life and death, dark and light, evil and goodness, demon and angel. We will cover subjects such as superstitions and folklore, haunted locations, cryptids, mythology, the ancient craft, haunted travel, and dark history, of course. This episode focuses on the Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, located in Weston, West Virginia. My first time at the Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, West Virginia. French historian Alexis de Tocqueville once said, "When the past no longer illuminates the future, the spirit walks in darkness." He was a political thinker with his feet grounded firmly in the faith of Roman Catholicism. Alexis and I have nothing in common whatsoever, except that his famous quote popped into my head the very first time I laid eyes on a certain mammoth stone-cut building. I was in Weston, West Virginia. The spirit walks in darkness, I thought. How apropos. As I gazed in awe at the largest stone-cut building in the Western Hemisphere, I was glad I could leave this asylum of my own free will and not hear the doors slam shut as thousands of committed souls had done so in 150 years of operation. The building had many names through the years of its operation: the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane, Weston State Hospital, Weston Hospital, and the Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, known also as TALA. When it first opened its doors in 1864, it was meant to house just 250 patients, but by the 1950s, it was overcrowded, understaffed, criticized for inhumane treatments, and stained by scandals, patient murders, and suicides. The patient census climbed to 2,400 people by the time the polio vaccine was created, DNA was discovered, and Elvis was gyrating on the Ed Sullivan Show. I could tell that time the environment and neglect had taken its toll on the building. Over a century's worth of rain, snow, and scorching summer sun had made its mark. Interior walls were crumbling and cracked, and the paint was hanging, looking like little daggers pointing downwards. As I gazed at the vast expanse of beautiful green lawn sprawling around the asylum, the nice entrance road and the welcoming water fountain in the round, I knew it would not be so welcoming once I walked inside those large front doors. I was right. I had heard stories about this place growing up. You know, when you're a kid and adults talked in hushed tones so that you can't make out what is being said? If you're like me, you probably tended to strain and try to hear the details not meant for your innocent ears. It was this way with some of the stories that my Aunt Lou would share. I was raised in Northeast Ohio, but with lots of family still back in Central West Virginia. Aunt Lou was my mother's sister, and what a sister she was. We always enjoyed our time spent with her. She was always cracking jokes and telling stories. Aunt Lou was also the best registered nurse you could ever ask for and lived just a few miles from the hospital in the small town of Lost Creek. Her tales of working at Weston State Hospital were an instant recall the day that I strolled through that big, heavy front door. It was a stifling summer day. The temperatures were in the 90s, and of course, of all days, this was the one day that I'd chosen to do the long tour. I was in a group of about 7 people, and I was the only one with a camera, notepad, and digital recorder. I must have looked like a reporter. The guide that day was very knowledgeable and had worked there at the same time that my aunt had. She knew my aunt's name, but could not recall anything else about her. I tried not to fall behind as we walked up and down the long hallways, peering into the small patient rooms with peeling paint and dirty bar-covered windows. Some of the windows were broken like the dreams of so many patients, I imagined. As I stood at one patient window in particular, I got instant goosebumps, even though it was a muggy day, both outside and inside the hospital. I acknowledge the fact that many patients locked inside this very room had nothing else to do but stand in the same spot I was standing in and look at the same view I was looking at. It was creepy to say the least, and I was glad the tour was starting again with the move on down the long and dim hallway. More than once, I saw some of the other tour guests glancing over their shoulders. You could almost feel it. The air was thick and stale, but had a bit of a charge to it, for lack of a better word. It felt almost static like as we climbed another staircase and made our way up to the doctor's quarters. I was busy snapping photos and taking notes and wishing that I'd had more than two hands. I was also wishing I'd been more prepared in regards to possibly bringing a book bag. I'd already bought a t-shirt and a book on Weston state history from the gift shop. I was also glad that I'd left the high heels at home. This building has nearly 5 miles of interior hallways. As we climbed yet another staircase and stepped into one of the apartments, one of the women yelled suddenly and said that someone had poked her in the middle of her back. The tour guide said simply, you'll have that sometimes. I knew exactly what she meant. After owning a haunted tour company for decades, I was overly familiar with the paranormal, as it was normal to. But for the woman who was poked in the back, it was anything but normal. I saw her dab her perspiring face with her sleeve repeatedly. Her eyes would dart to the corners of the room. She started to shuffle her feet a bit and seemed very nervous as she cleared her throat and asked if she could quit the tour early. Our tour guest was guided to a staircase and pointed the way down and out of the building. We waved goodbye and watched her leave our sight. The tour guide never said a word after that until we were downstairs at the end of our walkthrough. The guide said that she tried to keep her day tours strictly historic, but quite a few times someone would have an experience on her tour that defied explanation. This was one of those times. The long day tour continued without any more paranormal activity. We all enjoyed the historical information offered up and some of our guide's personal recollections of her working years at the hospital. We had explored all 4 floors of the main hospital building, had stepped inside the medical building, and had toured around the back of the hospital, entering into a courtyard in another section of the hospital known as the Civil War section. This piqued my interest, as I've been a Confederate Civil War reenactor since 1998, and the 1860s had been my area of keen interest. The Civil War section is the oldest part of the hospital, and I felt an immediate connection to it. Something told me that this area had to be pretty active, paranormally speaking, of course. For the next 20 minutes, we continued with our tour and eventually maneuvered our way back to the main entrance area. It was still very hot, and everyone, excluding me, of course, was glad that the tour was concluding. I could have walked and explored for hours. We all thanked the matronly guide, and several of us tipped her for her hospitality and her tour knowledge. We said our goodbyes and ambled to the front door past an old-timey wheelchair. The hot afternoon sun was shining through the decorative glass transom windows above the front door. It was casting these reflective glimmers of light, and beautiful rainbows were dancing across the hospital floor. The historic day tour was over, but my love affair with an abandoned old asylum in West Virginia was just beginning. Reasons for committal. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, terms such as madness, lunacy, or insanity, all of which assumed a unitary psychosis, were split into numerous mental diseases, of which catatonia, melancholia, and dementia praecox, which is modern day schizophrenia, these were the most common in psychiatric institutions. The treatment of patients in early lunatic asylums was sometimes brutal and focused on containment and restraints. How could a person end up in such an institution against their will? Well, the reasons for committal were varied back in the early days at institutions such as Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Older folks who had no one to take care of them could simply walk into the hospital, sign some papers, and stay there till their dying day. Family members would often be embarrassed about their slow family member and have them become a resident as well. Boys and young men who were caught masturbating could be committed. Children who had ailments such as smallpox, heart disease such as mitral valve prolapse, exhaustion, or tuberculosis could be committed. In 1912, 12-year-old John Green was admitted and then died from epilepsy. He is buried in one of the asylum cemeteries. Teenager William Lee Gum died of tuberculosis in 1933. He is also buried in an unmarked grave in the asylum cemetery. Women who were pregnant and were soon to bear illegitimate children could be committed by their family simply out of shame. Such was the case of a young woman committed at Tala who was pregnant from rape as a result from her stepfather. Amenorrhea was listed as a cause for committal, as we see in the case of an 18-year-old woman who was committed for amenorrhea and acute mania. Amenorrhea is a suppression or unusual absence of menstruation. She could have been pregnant or suffered from a medical condition that was unknown at the time, such as a glandular issue. Suspicions of crime or suicide are also alluded to in the list of reasons for committal. Among the admissions are entries for gunshot wounds, shooting a child, and rumor of husband murder, whatever that entails. Other reasons to be admitted were depression, alcoholism, just being a little different from the norm, and even going through menopause. It's apparent that menopause or the change of life was a popular reason for committal, and the husband could simply sign a paper and leave his wife and their children at the asylum forever or until he came back to sign them out. Note the case of admission number 6 in 1864. She was 87 years old and married. She was committed for domestic trouble and dementia and was a housekeeper in Virginia before she was deposited into the asylum's growing census. While researching this project, I found some very disturbing cases, not just as Tala in the early years, but also at asylums all over the United States. In the early 1800s, wives and daughters were often committed for not being obedient enough to their husbands or their fathers. Women were expected to be homemakers and not much was given to their education. If a woman spoke out and went against the norm, she could be committed. I first became aware of this a couple of years ago. I was visiting a courthouse and noticed the term lunacy on many of the women's admission forms. Shockingly enough, a woman could be quite often divorced for reasons of lunacy. Her husband would put her in the asylum and then conveniently file for divorce. New wife, new life. Men were committed for various reasons as well. This one chanced to be the very first male admission to Tala in 1864. He was the 12th admission at the asylum and was admitted for melancholia and sunstroke. Sunstroke. He was just 53 years old. A 38-year-old merchant from Mason County was admitted later that year for the war and probably suffering from what we know as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. In the same year, you have another male being admitted for masturbation at age 28 in February of 1864. He was a cabinet maker from Virginia and apparently had been spotted doing the evil act of masturbation, quote unquote, which caused his acute mania. Many doctors and those in society as well believe that alterations of blood flow during any sexual activity could lead to nerve damage, insanity, and blindness. An 18th century Swiss physician named Tissot believed that masturbation was especially hazardous in this respect. An American physician of that era, Benjamin Rush, also viewed the practice of masturbation as dangerous to mental and physical health. He wrote several widely read articles on the subject. Even the man who initiated the Boy Scouts had his view. Lord Baden-Powell, founder of the Boy Scout movement, stated, quote, "If masturbation becomes a habit, it quickly destroys both health and spirits. He becomes feeble in mind and body and often ends in a lunatic asylum." End quote. Admissions were often linked to sex, love, and everything in between, even those with broken hearts. Another sad case at the asylum involved a broken heart and a spiritual medium, and this was published in the Kansas City Star, dated March 26, 1899. The newspaper headline read, "His Long Walk for Nothing. A Man's Tramp from Missouri to Pennsylvania to Marry in the Finale," from the Pittsburgh Dispatch, Parkersburg, Pennsylvania. During the blizzard a few weeks ago, a man of about 25 years of age, dressed as a cowboy, appeared at the police headquarters and asked for lodging. He claimed to be from Granby, Missouri, from which place he had trudged on foot for the purpose of marrying a young girl named Ethel Darkwood. Ethel's home was in Upper Glades, Webster County, West Virginia, and she was said to be worth $25. The fellow gave his name as John Fairby, and he had tickets from a St. Louis matrimonial agency stating that he was a member of the association and that he had been authorized to marry Miss Ethel Darkwood. He remained here overnight and started to walk the remaining 200 miles at the distance, refusing railroad transportation. A report reached here Saturday that he'd been arrested and jailed at Addison in Webster County as a lunatic. It developed that when he reached Upper Glades and found the woman, she was a widow with one child and in humble circumstances. As he was penniless, she refused to marry him, and he lost all reason. When he passed through here, he carried a picture of a handsome country girl who he said was his fiancée, and stated that he had seen and conversed with her. It now seems that he saw and talked with the girl through the means of a spiritual medium, who also furnished him the photograph. He will be sent to the Weston Asylum for the Insane. When children were committed, oftentimes the families, probably due to embarrassment, would tell others that they had died. Some children were committed from being an unwanted pregnancy, for disobedience or illnesses such as Down syndrome or autism. In as late as 1958, we have a stillborn being birthed at the hospital, only to end up buried in one of the hospital cemeteries that sit back out behind the main hospital building. The little Crookshank baby was born on November 30th, 1958, and went to be with the Lord. A much better place to be than the asylum, we would all agree. Little Henry Zink was only 6 years old when he died on July 13th, 1929, from spina bifida. He is burial number 2338 in the cemetery record book, compiled by Marlene Tenney, Joy Stolniger, and Hartzell Strader. And now I'd like to share with you a list of reasons for committal at Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum for the years 1864 to to 1889. Amenorrhea, bad company, bad habits and political excitement, bad whiskey, bite of a rattlesnake, bloody flux, brain fever, business nerves, carbonic acid gas, carbuncle, cerebral softening, cold, congestion of the brain, crime, death of sons in the war, deranged masturbation, desertion by husband, diphtheria, disappointed affection, disappointment, disappointed love, dog bite, domestic affliction, domestic trouble, doubt about his mother's ancestors, effusion on the brain, epileptic fits, explosion of a shell nearby, fall from a horse, false confinement, female disease, fever, fever and jealousy, gastritis, gathering in the head, greediness, grief, gunshot wound, hysteria, immoral life, imprisonment, indigestion, intemperance, jealousy, kicked in the head by a horse, laziness, loss of an arm, masturbation and syphilis, mental excitement, milk fever, novel reading, opium habit, overheated, politics, religious excitement, seduction, self-abuse, sexual abuse, sexual derangement, smallpox, softening of the brain, sunstroke, superstition, the war, time of life, trouble, uterine derangement, venereal excesses, vices, women trouble, worms, and young lady in fear. My, oh my, how things have changed in this area of psychiatry. We've come a long way, baby. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Haunted History with me, Sherri Brake. If you're interested in my events, my programs, my ghost tours, my trips to Ireland and Scotland, please check out my website at hauntedhistory.net. I'm on Instagram as River Styx, and I also have various Facebook pages under Sherri Brake, Haunted Heartland Tours, and the names of my books. I've been investigating the paranormal and researching all things odd and intriguing for over 30 years. My love for the paranormal has resulted in over 20 books being published. I own Haunted Heartland Tours, and I'm thrilled to be celebrating 20 years in 2022 as a business owner. I never see this as a job. I see it as a calling. And what's my calling? To share my ghost stories, my love of dark history, and this intriguing subject that we call haunted history. Ghost stories don't need to be made up. History is frightening enough. Don't you agree? So until we meet again, I'll see you on the Haunted Highway.